three universities are making part of the project. Three main universities in Mexico City. So we distribute and publish this conversation to the public, not now, later in other days. And here we have a fall from Brazil, Valeria Ramos. Welcome, Valeria. ¿Tú le puedes habilitar el micrófono a Valeria, Pedrone, por favor? You can speak now.
Now it's okay. Good night, everyone. Everybody, thanks, Guillermo, for your invitation, and a pleasure to meet you, Justin. It's I'm very thankful for your invitation.
She's part of a team in Brazil. They are working very hard for asbestos abatement. I told you the other day. So in the coming days, I'm going to do an introduction to our guideline to them.
Oh, good.
Yes, and we are going to work together in a guideline for Brazil, probably Mexico and Colombia too. Having in mind our own social conditions, because it's quite different, the situation in Australia and the technical and the experience you have through all these years, before the experience that we are learning by now, and trying to apply this little knowledge that we have about these issues of asbestos abatement, So we are going to work together. Probably we could invite you one day later to give us a talk or to share some thoughts about what we are doing with the Funda Centro team in Brazil and Colombia, to share our experiences and to learn from you, especially from Australia. It is 1 minute. Let's give us 5 minutes for waiting for other people, and we can start.
How extensive was the use in Brazil? I mean, has there been any estimates of how many public buildings or residential buildings or commercial buildings would contain asbestos?
No, I don't know. We don't. Excuse me, I have some difficulty to speak in English. I'm trying. And
no, it's very good.
We don't have, how can I say inventário in English? We don't count, we don't look for the construction. We are just starting now. And in Brazil, it's not obligated, we don't have a law that to remove the asbestos. Only in Santa Catarina, in Florianópolis, we have a law, but it's a new law and we didn't start yet to remove and look for the installations. We don't know almost nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is no data yet, there in Brazil. And she's saying that it's not mandatory, to remove asbestos. I don't know places where it's mandatory to remove asbestos, following strict protocols. I don't think that's happening in Australia, or yes.
No, it doesn't happen in Australia. Well, there is one government that has a program to remove from its public buildings, and it does that sort of based on the risk that the materials are posing in terms of fibre release. So that's the only program. And of course, where I am in the Australian Capital Territory, we had an issue with loose fill asbestos that was used as insulation in ceilings, and the government there had a program where it purchased the properties from the owners and then it demolished the properties and resold the land. So there's a few things going on, but it's not like an obligation on duty holders that if you have you know, if you have a building that you've got management and control of and it contains asbestos, you have to remove it. There's no obligation like that.
Yeah, but what happened when somebody in his own house is doing asbestos abatement without protocols?
That really is covered. It all depends of whether they have a worker help them out. So if like they get a tradesperson in or something like that to do some plumbing or whatever, that would then fall under work health and safety laws. And if they disturb the asbestos, it needs to be removed. So, and what I'll sort of speak about in my presentation, what we did in Australia is when we put the ban in 2003, we said that materials that were in situ could stay in situ as long as they were sort of in good condition. But once they are disturbed, they are no longer in situ, and that's when they do need to be removed.
Okay. Can we start to translate, Mr. Jake? Thank you. Okay. It's 7:05. I think it's the moment to go. Ok, muchas gracias a todos por su presencia. Esta sesión es parte de las actividades del proyecto Abordaje Transdisciplinario de la epidemia de mesotelioma maligno pleural por exposición al asbesto en San Pedro Barrientos, dirigido por el doctor Alejandro Cabello López, investigador de la Unidad de Investigación de Salud en el Trabajo del Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social. El proyecto incluye acciones de investigación e intervención para encontrar soluciones al problema de salud y ambiente relacionados con la contaminación por asbesto, mediante 5 acciones fundamentales. Primero, monitoreo ambiental de partículas de asbesto. 2, vigilancia a la salud mediante el uso de marcadores de diagnóstico temprano para mesotelioma pleural. 3, propuesta jurídica y de políticas públicas para lograr la prohibición del uso del asbesto. 4, educación y comunicación del problema mediante talleres, pedagogías y material audiovisual para difusión. Y 5, actividades para el fortalecimiento de la comunidad mediante alianzas nacionales e internacionales para la prohibición del asbesto, así como actividades con miembros de las comunidades afectadas por las enfermedades asociadas a este mineral. Es en el marco de este proyecto que desde la Fundación Colombia Libre de Asbesto estamos realizando este ciclo de charlas con expertos internacionales para acercar a este grupo de trabajo y a toda la comunidad relacionada en las complejas tramas que rodean al asbesto desde la dimensión médica, jurídica, técnica y científica, como puede ser el manejo del asbesto instalado, o las experiencias del activismo político en otros países que buscan prohibir el asbesto o ya lo han prohibido. Australia fue uno de los mayores consumidores de materiales con asbesto a nivel mundial, debido a una historia de minería extensiva y al uso generalizado de este mineral en la fabricación de miles de productos y materiales de construcción. Desde la década de 1960, Australia ha sido líder mundial en la restricción y prohibición progresivas de la extracción, fabricación y uso del asbesto. Reconocieron que sin más acciones decisivas, los australianos continuarían enfermándose gravemente o morirían debido a la exposición a las fibras de asbesto. Esta situación, sumada a diversos estudios que a lo largo del siglo XX dieron como resultado distintas patologías asociadas al uso del asbesto, incluyendo cáncer de laringe, ovarios, de pulmón y mesotelioma, hicieron que Australia prohibiera por completo, a nivel nacional, el uso del asbesto el 31 de diciembre de 2003. Sin embargo, el uso del asbesto en el pasado en Australia ha dejado un legado bastante dañino. Australia tiene una de las tasas más altas de enfermedades relacionadas con el asbesto de cualquier país del mundo. Actualmente unos 4.000 australianos mueren cada año debido a la exposición al asbesto, lo que representa más del doble de la cantidad anual de muertes en carreteras australianas. Adicionalmente, gracias a una sólida política pública ejecutada eficientemente por la Agencia para la Seguridad y Erradicación del Asbesto, el gobierno federal de Australia ha liderado un enfoque nacional sobre los problemas del asbesto que abarcan la salud pública, los asuntos ambientales y la seguridad en el trabajo. A partir de ello, han desarrollado diversos planes, programas y proyectos en el país con el objetivo de eliminar las enfermedades relacionadas con el asbesto, prevenir la exposición al mineral y regular su erradicación y manipulación. ASEA, Asbestos Safety and Eradication Agency, fue establecida en Australia el 1 de julio de 2013 para proveer un enfoque sobre los problemas con el manejo del asbesto que va más allá de la seguridad en el lugar del trabajo y que abarca asuntos ambientales y de salud pública. Una de las prioridades de la agencia es administrar el Plan Estratégico Nacional. La investigación en el marco de la primera fase del Plan Estratégico Nacional 2014-2018 fue de naturaleza exploratoria pero específica. Se centró en temas considerados importantes para comprender mejor cómo lidiar con el legado del asbesto en Australia. La investigación sobre la seguridad del asbesto cubrió áreas como el asbesto en la comunidad, la identificación del asbesto y la gestión del asbesto heredado. El Plan Estratégico Nacional busca desarrollar la sensibilización y la gestión del asbesto con el objetivo de eliminar las enfermedades relacionadas con este mineral en Australia mediante la prevención de la exposición a las fibras de asbesto. De esta manera supervisan las acciones nacionales para mejorar la sensibilización sobre el asbesto y la gestión en 4 aspectos muy importantes. 1. Mejorar la sensibilidad social sobre el asbesto para influir en el cambio de los comportamientos respecto de este mineral. 2. Lograr una identificación y gestión eficaz del legado del asbesto instalado. 3. Conseguir una eliminación prioritaria y segura junto a una gestión eficaz de los residuos de asbesto. 4. Desarrollar colaboración y ejercer liderazgo internacional. Justine Ross, nuestra invitada de esta noche, es directora general de la agencia desde agosto de 2018 por un periodo de 5 años. Anteriormente fue directora del Grupo de Política de Seguridad y Salud en el Trabajo en el Departamento de Empleo y Pequeñas Empresas, responsable de la elaboración de políticas y del asesoramiento en materia de seguridad y salud en el trabajo e indemnización de los trabajadores de la Commonwealth, indemnización de los trabajadores marítimos y asuntos de seguridad y salud en el trabajo, asuntos relacionados con el asbesto y cuestiones de relaciones laborales relativas al sector de la construcción. Y anteriormente fue miembro del Safe Work Australia y funcionaria de la Comisión de Seguridad, Rehabilitación e Indemnización. La señora Rose es licenciada en Derecho y en Filosofía y Letras por la Universidad de Macquarie y ha realizado un máster en Salud y Seguridad en el Trabajo en el Centro Internacional de Formación de la Organización Internacional del Trabajo en la Universidad de Turín, Italia. Antes de cederle la palabra a nuestra invitada, queremos decirles que contamos con traducción simultánea en la parte inferior de su ventana a esta conferencia por Zoom. Y para la sesión de preguntas y respuestas, les recomendamos que las hagan llegar por el chat de esta misma conferencia. Bienvenidos a todos. Bienvenida, doctora Justine Rose. Muchas gracias por aceptar amablemente nuestra invitación. Señoras y señores, con ustedes la señora Justine Rose. Adelante, Justine.
Thank you. I'm just going to try to share my screen, although I don't know whether that's working. Okay. All right. Has that come up all right?
It is working, yeah.
It is working. Is it in presentation mode? Or is it in notes mode?
We are seeing your screen, Justine.
Yeah, so you're seeing the slides, that's okay?
Don't you see her? We are seeing. ¿Tú la ves, Odette, la pantalla?
Sí, sí, sí la veo.
¿Tú no la ves,
I see,
Jake?
I can see.
Todos la podemos ver, Jake. All of us, we are watching the screen, your screen, Justine. If you want, go ahead.
We can actually see the presentation. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll just get started, and it's a pleasure to join you. It's early morning here in Australia, and I just want to acknowledge that I'm presenting today on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people in the Australian Capital Territory. So some beautiful traditional lands, and I want to pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So I just want to speak to you today on Australia's asbestos legacy and what challenges it poses for us in Australia, and the framework that we have in place for managing that legacy and its ultimate removal from the built environment. So you heard a little bit about my agency, the Asbestos Safety and Eradication Agency. Our key function in Australia is to manage the national strategic plan. I often say it's a pity that we had to have an agency set up. It's the only dedicated standalone agency in the world devoted to asbestos issues. And while that is a fantastic thing, I guess it's a sort of a shame that we used for so long, and we have such a large legacy that we actually need an agency dedicated just to dealing with it, and a national strategic plan dedicated to dealing with those issues. Of course, it would have been better if Australia never used asbestos in the first place, particularly in that post-Second World War period between about 1940 to about 1970, where we used millions and millions of tonnes of asbestos. So I guess my role in coordinating the National Strategic Plan is working with the states and territories. So Australia is a federation. I'm with the central government, and the central government does not have responsibility for asbestos management and removal. It's the states and territories that have governments that have that responsibility. So just a little bit about how extensive the legacy is in Australia. We imported about 1.9 million tonnes of raw asbestos during about 100 years. We used asbestos from about 1900 to when it was eventually banned in 2003. And that 1.9 million tonnes of raw asbestos was turned into we've estimated to be about 13 million tonnes of asbestos containing material that, as I said, were put into our built environment. We estimated in 2020 that we have around 6.5 million tonnes of asbestos containing materials that remain in the built environment. Our current laws say that asbestos is in good condition and is well protected and is not disturbed, that it's okay to stay in place and that it's safe. But I think there's a little bit of a flaw in that premise, because often people don't know where it is, so they disturb it unintentionally. They don't know how to make that assessment that it is in good condition. So unfortunately, I think we have a lot of inadvertent exposures taking place every day in Australia. So we recognised that sooner or later all asbestos-containing materials will be disturbed, they will deteriorate, and they continue to put life at risk. Unfortunately, it is not an over-exaggeration to say that asbestos-containing materials can be found in every region and in every town in Australia, no matter how remote. And it's a very sad thing that a lot of our very remote communities have a lot of asbestos-containing materials, which creates challenges in terms of the removal and disposal of that material, because Australia is such a large continent. Now, I'm hoping that you can actually see my slides, because one of the slides I'm showing at the moment is a national residential heat map, which we have just completed. So we have just completed a project using artificial intelligence to try to get some understanding of the extent of the asbestos legacy within our residential environment. It is really challenging, I think, because of the lack of documentation of finding where these materials actually are. So this map that we have produced has is mapped by the probability of homes, so residential homes containing asbestos. And the probability is described using an 8-point scale to define the likelihood of asbestos presence, from exceptionally unlikely to almost virtually certain. The areas in dark blue show that it is virtually certain that homes within that area contain asbestos. So there's a 99% certainty. In the areas in light blue, the percentage there is also exceptionally high. We found that the predictability of using artificial intelligence, which was bringing together a few data sets where we knew there was the presence of asbestos, with data sets that indicated the absence of asbestos, and bringing that together to give us this map, was exceptionally accurate. So as you can see, there's a lot of blue, particularly down what we call the east coast of Australia, where the majority of the population is located. Areas in Australia where you do not find asbestos-containing materials are because they may be national parks, they're non-residential areas, or they're actually extremely remote areas, deserts and things like that. So it was a real wake-up call for us to get the results of this map, because it really does show what we're dealing with just in the residential environment. And we want to actually expand this work and also cover the commercial sector and public buildings within Australia. So I'll just move on from that map, but that's it's been an exciting piece of work for us, and we really are starting to see that the use of artificial intelligence is really going to help us with this large legacy problem that we have here in Australia. So just a little bit on Australia's progress towards a ban. It really began in 1999, when the body responsible for the assessment of hazardous chemicals in Australia concluded that all asbestos-containing material, or asbestos types should be banned for the protection of human health. And previously, and this was final ban was a ban of chrysotile asbestos. It was because of the effort of the union movement in Australia that led to that body doing that assessment. And once that body came to that conclusion, it was the union movement that really pushed government to put their conclusions in that assessment into law. So a decision was made by all governments in 2001 that there would be a total ban in Australia by the 31st of December 2003. And that ban did come into effect. And you know, there was a lot of work involved in getting the legal framework in place, in making sure getting the goods out of the supply chain as well. For a few years, very limited exceptions that applied to some materials. They were mainly friction products. But all those exceptions have now been removed because there are alternative materials and products available. I can say that it's one area, and I've worked in government in Australia for 20 years, and it's difficult, you know, working in the national government and working with the state and territory governments, but it's one area where all governments work together to achieve a result and actually met the time frame. So even our most recent experience we've had with all governments working together, which has been the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, governments all went a little bit in a different direction and had different restrictions. But this is one area where all governments have been united to protect the health of Australians. So, and the health impact has been considerable. So even after having a total ban in place for almost 20 years, we still see that it's estimated that over 4,000 Australians die each year of asbestos-related diseases. And again, look, to put that into perspective with the pandemic in Australia, we have had, which is tragic as well, of course, but we have had around just over 10,000 deaths in Australia from the pandemic, which goes to show what can happen when governments do act decisively. This is, of course, a legacy issue due to the large gap between exposure and development of disease. We actually think that in the last few years, these numbers actually have peaked. So we will see this estimated 4,000 deaths for the next few years, and then the death rate will start going down. We are very concerned about the exposures in the non-occupational environment. The 4,000 deaths that are estimated each year are largely due to occupational exposure. So the workers that were involved in asbestos production, the workers who worked with the materials in constructing buildings, and also took the fibres home on their clothes and exposed their families. Most of the deaths that are occurring each year make up that cohort, but we are actually concerned with the non-occupational, the risk today of people disturbing asbestos-containing materials in their homes, and we are doing some further work on that. Look, when I give these presentations, I really sort of try to stress that, you know, action really needs to start to prevent future death. The longer that restrictions and bans on asbestos are delayed, the greater the costs are, and that's both in terms of dollar to cost and also the health of the population. And, you know, Australia is sort of, I think, is a really good example of that. We used for way too long, and as I say, almost 20 years after banning, disease rates are still too high. So I also like to show a slide, and I hope you can see this. It's a slide that's a courtesy of Professor Tim Driscoll, who's the epidemiologist at Sydney University. And he often shows that the rate of deaths that have been estimated under the global burden of disease in Australia, in high-income North America, in Western Europe as well. And he often says, well, that's where those bars are sitting at the moment, but give it another 30 years and you'll see, I guess, a flip of that, and you'll see that the countries in Southeast Asia in Central Asia, in Africa, in other parts in Latin America as well, that they will be where Australia and Western Europe is now, if use does not stop. So at the beginning, I gave an acknowledgement to the traditional owners of Australia, our First Nations people, and I really do think it is a tragedy that that Australia's asbestos history has also impacted First Nations Indigenous Australians. There are many examples where they were impacted and their traditional lands are contaminated by asbestos mining. So there is a large mine in Western Australia that we call Wittenoom, and the mining commenced there in 1943. The former mine extends over an area of approximately 400 hectares, and the site, just in terms of rock dump, is they have estimated to comprise 75 million tonnes of waste rock. There are open pits, and there's considerable quantities of water on site as well. So this town has just recently finally been closed in Australia. Many of the residents of this town did not want to leave the town, and it's going to take a huge effort and whether it can even be possible to clean up this town and the surrounding region, to return the lands to the traditional owners. So there are many examples of this, and there are also examples in New South Wales as well, of where traditional lands have been contaminated with asbestos. We also find out in communities, in Indigenous communities, a lot of asbestos-containing material reused as part of the housing stock. So, which is in recent years has been replaced by other building products, but the soil is contaminated, and that can occur from extreme weather events and things like that, from breaking up the structures and contaminating the soil. So there's a huge environmental problem, as well as a huge economic problem as well. So we have estimated that the direct health system cost to be 100. Oh. Can you hear me okay now? Yep. Thank you. So we've estimated that the direct health system costs are approximately 192 million, and that's in Australian dollars. And I think that currently one Australian dollar, I think it's 65 cents to $1 US at the moment. And just in indirect cost to the workforce and to the community of being 321 million. So that's extensive. In 2012, it was estimated, we did an estimation as well about what it would cost to remove asbestos from all government and commercial buildings by 2030, and that came in at 114 billion, and that's not counting the residential sector. So that's just government and commercial buildings. We've had, I guess you could say we've been fortunate in Australia, and it's been through the effort of the trade union movement that they were able to hold one of the major producers, James Hardie, to account for asbestos disease compensation. So James Hardie is still a going concern in Australia, so it's still quite a large company, and it pays into a fund every year, part of its profit, to compensate those who have developed asbestos-related disease from using their products. But that the compensation is just a small fraction of what it is going to cost to remove all this material from our built environment and say those ongoing other economic impacts, the direct health system cost and the indirect workforce cost. So it's a tragedy that, you know, the economic consequences are shifted to future generations in this space, and that those that were responsible for the exposure are not held accountable. And you know, and that is the problem. That's the legacy problem that we have. So you know, when we were using, neither the affected workers or the employers responsible were warned or knew immediately that they were exposed. So, you know, the burden of disease does not actually fall on those responsible. It actually falls many years later on governments and the community. And it is often the case that the miners, the manufacturers and the employers, they no longer exist. They're no longer in operation. So they don't actually pay for the destruction that they have caused. As you heard, we have quite an extensive national framework in place. We have that national strategic plan, and that's to drive, focus and coordinate efforts. It has 4 national priorities, and that they all cover the asbestos life cycle. So raising awareness, identifying the materials in the environment and effectively managing them, planning for their removal from the environment, making sure they're disposed of safely. And the final one, the international leadership and collaboration. So Australia, using its lessons it's learnt from its extensive use to encourage other countries around the world to stop use or to help them manage their legacy. And there's 2 reasons why we have a plan in Australia. As I mentioned, it is because we are a federation, so we do need to ensure that across Australia, that the national government and the states and territory government are all working towards a shared purpose. And then there's a second reason, it's because, and I think this is what makes asbestos management so difficult, is it involves a number of government agencies. So it can involve the Labor Department, the Environment Department, the Health Department, and then a whole range of other infrastructure departments, a whole range of government agencies. And we need to make sure that they are all working together, that all their actions are coordinated to reduce that duplication of effort that you know, often goes on in this space. So the aim of the plan is to prevent exposure to asbestos fibres in order to eliminate asbestos-related diseases in Australia. And that acknowledges that it may not be possible to actually eliminate all asbestos-containing materials from Australia because, you know, I think we'll have that issue of land contamination for probably thousands of years. But we can eliminate asbestos-related diseases or get that number down to as low as we possibly can. So Australia's legislative framework is now quite comprehensive. It didn't start that way, but it now has become quite comprehensive. I often see it as that I think that there is 2 key bans that are in place. One ban is through the import and export laws, so to stop the importation of asbestos into Australia. And we have quite a good system at our border to prevent illegal imports from coming in as well. And the other key ban is actually through our work health and safety laws, our occupational safety and health laws. And it is through that law that we actually ban the use of Australia. And that does have hooks then into the non-workplace environment as well. We also have public health laws that protect people in their homes We have environmental protection laws that deal with those issues of contamination. And we also not only have major issues of contamination at a former mining site, we also have major issues of contamination where the manufacturers turn the raw material into asbestos-containing products. So on some of those sites, which are now in highly desirable areas within our capital cities, they cannot be used. A lot of them are turned into parklands. And we also have laws that cover the transportation of dangerous goods. So they cover the transporting of asbestos-containing materials that are removed from the built environment to landfill. Look, and just very quickly, I just think it's useful to point out that there are international conventions that underpin, of course, the making of the law in Australia. So our import and export laws are underpinned by the Rotterdam Convention on prior informed consent, and we have just some key features of those laws are, of course, the definition of asbestos and asbestos-containing materials. So we do not list every asbestos-containing product or material. We just have a broad definition. The prohibition, the threshold amount is really important as well, because in Australia it's 0. So asbestos-free in Australia means asbestos-free. It means it does not contain any asbestos at all. So it doesn't allow for 0.1 or 1% or anything like that. It's absolutely 0. We have exceptions to those bans, but it's very narrow. They're only for display, research, and analysis. And I actually give permission for asbestos to be imported in those circumstances, but they're very, very narrow exceptions. And most of the permissions I give relate to bringing a sample of materials in to check that they're asbestos-free before importers may bring in bulk shipments of the product. So, for example, we've had issues where we've had children's crayons contain asbestos. So a sample of those crayons will be tested in Australia to confirm that they are asbestos-free, and then the shipment will be brought into Australia. We have really large penalty levels attached to illegal import, and it actually sits up in the same category as bringing in illegal drugs, illicit drugs, or guns into Australia. So you can be imprisoned for bringing asbestos into Australia, and the penalty level for an unlawful import is actually, in dollar terms, is significant. It's quite high. For our public health laws, I mean, they're underpinned by a range of World Health Assembly resolutions, and they have, again, so their key features is the definition. They have a range of prohibition and duties, and they also have powers for authorised officers. So authorised officers can go to a residential home. If someone is disturbing asbestos-containing materials in their home, exposing themselves and exposing their neighbours, they can go and issue notices, fines and things like that. We actually have one of a significant issue we have is that people cleaning their asbestos-containing roofs, and particularly with high pressure water cleaners, they might get up there and try to clean the moss or the mold off their roofs, and that can then contaminate not only their home, their land, but also the home and the lands around them. So public health laws just contain a general duty not to cause harm to yourself or those around you, but there are some public health laws in Queensland and Western Australia that do actually mention asbestos and have particular requirements and controls in relation to asbestos. Environmental protection laws, well, the international instrument underpins those is the Basel Convention, and the environmental protection laws mainly deal with waste, asbestos waste, making sure that it is disposed at a licensed facility. And there's large penalties for illegally disposing of asbestos waste. So just dumping it on the side of the road. We have a problem with people often go and dump in bushland in Australia because they don't want to pay the expense of dumping, or not of dumping, sorry, of disposing at a licensed facility. And it also, the environmental protection laws also cover the contaminated sites as well. So those sites that I was talking about, the former mine sites, sites of production, they are all registered sites. They all have to have a plan, and it's the Environmental Protection Authority that makes sure that the owners of those sites keep those plans up to date, and that there's no exposure risk emanating from those sites. Our work health and safety laws, as I said, look, they're the main vehicle for both the prohibition on the use in Australia and also how we manage it. And of course, you know, there's the International Labour Organization conventions that in Australia underpin those laws. So those laws involve the management of risks to health and safety of workers at a workplace, and they contain the most detailed requirements. I won't go through them because they sort of really are very extensive. I've just put a slide up which just is actually just the most I've been able to refine the elements of those laws from the actual laws themselves. They go over about 200 pages. So essentially, health monitoring occurs of workers who may be carrying out asbestos removal or asbestos related work. Waste as well at a work site. There's details around that you have to identify asbestos at the workplace. You have to record that asbestos in a to ensure that that the asbestos at the workplace is not we put it all into place. And then finally, I'll finish up because I've probably gone a little bit over, but we do a lot of campaigning work, awareness campaigning work. We are developing a big campaign at the moment. So we've developed a range of assets, and we will mainly run this campaign through social media, through paid social media placements. It is really aimed, we aim it at the non-workplace. So we aim it at the residential environment, our social media, our awareness campaign, because that's, as I said before, that's where we think that people are at risk of exposure because they just don't know. We think the workplace is highly regulated in terms of there's inspectors that go out to work sites, that monitor that there are asbestos registers and asbestos plans in place. So we are actually worried about the residential sector. So look, I'll just finish with what I think is the initial steps that particularly when we do a lot of work in Southeast Asia. So when I'm sort of advising Southeast Asian countries about where they should start, because it just seems so overwhelming. And it seems so overwhelming because Australia's laws and framework is so big. It's like, well, how do we put that all into place? I sort of start with, well, it's really important to put the ban in place for importation and use, because you've closed your borders to asbestos and you've stopped that use as well. And then you've got to set your exposure limits and thresholds. I mean, I know there is some debate at the moment about what exposure limits and thresholds should be. But in Australia, it is currently 0.1. You need to develop guidance for the safe management and removal of the legacy. You need to establish facilities to be able to test for asbestos as well, because you can't always tell that a material contains asbestos, and sometimes it is necessary to go and get a sample of the material tested at a lab. Well, our laws in Australia require that. Important to provide training for workers to make sure that they're working safely around asbestos, including the removal. Establishing those procedures to ensure that there's that safe disposal. Ensure that there is an inspector out there that's able to enforce the laws, and it's really important to start monitoring the health of workers as well. And finally, I do these things, of course, because I think there's a lot that we can share. We've got a lot to share in terms of sharing our experience. We've learned a lot of lessons, and we want to then make sure that others can learn from that. We can provide that advice on what frameworks need to be put into place and how the frameworks actually mesh together as well. We can share our research, and not only are we doing research on trying to identify the legacy in the built environment, we're doing research as well on how you can easily identify asbestos in materials. And we also do a lot of work in putting together our awareness materials, and to make sure that they have that behavioural objective of people being aware that asbestos may be in their home and what they need to do to keep themselves and their families safe. So sorry, that's been probably very quite comprehensive, and I've gone over a lot of ground, but thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Justine. Estoy seguro que ha sido una presentación muy importante para este grupo de expertos mexicanos que están trabajando el camino de la prohibición del asbesto en Australia. Has dicho temas muy puntuales que estoy seguro nos servirán bastante a nosotros. Más adelante seguramente trataremos de establecer un contacto más concreto contigo para probablemente solicitarte información que, repito, va a ser de gran utilidad para nosotros. Para la sesión de preguntas y respuestas, entonces le cedo la palabra a la doctora Odette Santos. Ella es maestra en Medicina Social y doctora en Ciencias en Salud Colectiva, y estará coordinando la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Adelante, Odette.
Muchas gracias, Justine, por tu excelente exposición. Bueno, hay unas preguntas aquí, te las voy a ir diciendo y poco a poco respondes, si te parece bien. ¿Cuál es el papel que han jugado las universidades en Australia para generar expertos o profesionales que puedan atender todos los aspectos de monitoreo y remoción? ¿Las empresas de remoción en Australia son públicas o privadas?
So the role that the universities have played in Australia, it has mainly been the epidemiologist, and that is monitoring the disease rates in Australia. So I sit on a committee, which is the Australian Mesothelioma Registry Expert Advisory Group. So it's mainly monitoring mesothelioma. That's a role that universities have largely played, and they are all public universities.
Claro que sí, sí. Sí, gracias, Justin. Te vamos a hacer otra pregunta. ¿Cuál fue el mayor desafío para la emisión de la ley de prohibición de asbesto en Australia?
Look, I think that the biggest challenge sort of came, I guess, from the manufacturers who were claiming that their products were safe to use, or they could be used safely. So there was, it was possible, a safe use was possible. And so as sort of said in my presentation, I mean, that's where the union movement was instrumental in not accepting that, and just so it was that and I guess it was probably the identification of disease as well, and that became really important, because I think the manufacturers were saying, well, their materials are safe, or they can be used safely, or there's no evidence of disease. But it was when the evidence of disease started coming through, and then the union movement about, well, who is going to compensate these victims of the use of your products? So, and the manufacturers themselves, they realised, even actually before the ban was put in place, that they had to stop using asbestos within their products. So they switched to asbestos-free products before the ban was actually implemented. So they moved themselves. But I can't stress how much in Australia it was the efforts of the union movement and the growing evidence that asbestos caused disease, and particularly mesothelioma. So relying on that international evidence as well, and bringing forth that international evidence to governments and pressing governments. Yeah, so, you know, it was difficult. There was a big fight, but I think that the fact that we were able to help two of the main manufacturers accountable for compensation has been a fantastic thing, and as I say, due to the efforts of the civil society and union movement.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Leila pregunta, ¿cómo funciona el sistema o los lugares donde se realizan las pruebas para identificar el asbesto? Esa es una. Y otra es, ¿cuáles son los requisitos para la recogida y el transporte de muestras?
Yeah, so look, the identification is tricky, because how the laws operate is that asbestos needs to be identified by a competent person, so a person who has the skills, training, and knowledge to identify asbestos, so what we would call an occupational hygienist. And they need to take a sample, they need to take it to a lab that is been accredited for the purposes of testing asbestos, and identify that whether that sample contains asbestos. If a duty holder does not want to do that, then they have to presume that the material is asbestos, and it has to be managed like it is asbestos containing material, which means that it's more costly than, so if you have a factory and you just presume that most of your factory inside and outside sheeting or the roof sheeting contains asbestos, then you need to have a register, you need to have a management plan, so it's more expensive than in terms of the maintenance of that factory. So that's how it works in Australia. We're actually looking at whether there is a way where testing might be able to be done on site, so sort of like a portable device that you might be able to take around site. There is one that does exist, but it doesn't identify to the standard that a lab does, and so it's, you know, the fourth, people are worried about the fourth negative, so, and it's not accepted that at the moment that portable testing method meets the requirements of the law. In terms of how you transport asbestos, well, there's in terms of waste, there's quite extensive guidance and laws that we have around that, how it needs to be wrapped and double wrapped and sealed and all those types of things, or if it's a big construction site, how the bins need to be lined and all that type of stuff, and transported in such a way that there is no fibre, that minimises the fibre release as far as is reasonably practical. Yeah, so we've developed over the years quite extensive guidance on that as well.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Tenemos otras preguntas más. Esteban pregunta, ¿cuáles son las medidas de reparación de daño que se han hecho para las comunidades indígenas y sus territorios?
Is that what are the, is that, does that mean what is the compensation? What is that the meaning of that? Can you just say that again?
Sí, claro. ¿Cuáles son las medidas de reparación de daño que se han hecho para las comunidades indígenas y territorios y sus territorios?
Yeah. Yes, so that's look, it's significant, and it's sort of done on a case-by-case basis. There's not, I guess, a program as such that is funded by government. So if an area is identified, then there will be a plan developed, and there will be. Look, probably best I give you an example. Up in the Northern Territory of Australia, there was a large area of traditional lands that had been used by our Department of Defence that were contaminated with asbestos, and those lands were being returned to the traditional people. So the government spent $425 million in cleaning up those lands so they could be returned to the traditional people. Now that's just one example. That's the only example that I know of. But we do some work in Indigenous communities in trying to clean up lands as well. But it's sort of like an area, yeah, where the governments are still doing it on a case-by-case basis, or identifying communities where it's needed the most, and cleaning up those lands. I think it's also the case that as the housing stock turns over, and you know, in the traditional communities, as that housing stock, the asbestos containing housing stock, is replaced by non-asbestos containing materials. So that's all funded by government as well. But I must say that, look, there is probably not enough going on, and it's a pity that we don't have a nation plan for it, because it is, again, that is the domain of each state and territory. So each state will have its plan and will focus in a particular area.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Justin. Yo tengo una pregunta, me parece muy importante que, aunada a la pregunta que te hicieron anteriormente, ¿cómo hacen la concientización de las personas o de los territorios por envenenamiento por asbesto?
It is really challenging, because we don't seem to, from our research, we don't seem to need to actually get people aware of the fact that asbestos causes cancer. That seems to be well known in Australia, and I think that is from this battle that we had a few years ago for compensation. So which received a lot of media attention and publicity, going after this company and getting them to pay victims. So the fact that asbestos causes cancer, people seem to be aware of that. The community seem to be aware of that, but they don't seem to know what it is that's going to put them at risk. So they don't seem to know what asbestos containing materials look like. So they don't seem to know that, you know, the sheeting, the internal, external sheeting of their homes contain asbestos. And then they don't seem to know what to do to stay safe around that. And we are actually hoping that by the releasing of that residential heat map, where people can go into their particular area, they can actually even drill down to their street and see the likelihood of their street containing asbestos, the houses in that street containing asbestos, we really hope that that's going to trigger that attitude and that behavioural change that is necessary to get people to understand, yes, it could be in your home, not something that's just in a public building or a commercial building, it actually could be in your home. And we find the same challenges with workers. They seem to think that it's a problem of the past. Oh, it's the older workers and they're all working with it every day. And, I'm not doing that. I come across it every so often, that type of thing. So that's really challenging, and challenging with the latency as well, for people to think, oh, well, maybe in 30, 40 years, I might end up with something, that type of attitude. So to overcome that type of attitude. So we actually do a lot of research into, and we use sort of behavioural insight to sort of guide all our awareness material.
Muchas gracias. Tenemos otras 2 preguntas. ¿Aún tenemos tiempo? ¿Sí? Listo. ¿Qué consejos nos podrías compartir para la remoción del asbesto en lugares donde el asbesto no está prohibido y no existen agencias profesionales que lo remuevan? En los casos donde los materiales de asbesto ya están rotos y las fibras están siendo liberadas al ambiente. Okay.
Yeah, well, that's it's tricky in countries where it's not banned, because if you don't have the bans in place, you probably don't have the other framework in place that require the management or removal of that material that is releasing those fibers into the air. So I guess we then look for sort of broad duties that may apply under the law somewhere else. I mean, that's why we rely even in Australia a lot on our public health laws, because they have broad duties that require, not to harm yourself or those around you. So we say that, people have a duty not to harm others. And that means that if those materials are deteriorating, they're releasing fibre, they're causing a health risk, they then should be removed. So we go searching, I guess, for some hook somewhere, and then advocate for action. But it is tricky, and even in our workplace laws, there is actually, when the materials are deteriorating, we have only discovered that there's a little, I guess, gap in the laws at the moment, that when the materials have deteriorated to such a degree that they are releasing fibre, the regulator doesn't have the ability to go in and issue a notice to get the duty holder to remove that asbestos. So they can penalise them, they can fine them, but they can't get them to remove it. So we are going to look at whether we can close what we've discovered to be a gap. But it's that advocacy work, it's that lobbying, and again we call on our particularly our non-government stakeholders, the union movement and the victim support groups in Australia, and we do a lot of advocacy work with them. We get the media involved as well if we think that there's an area and it's putting people at risk and nothing is being done.
Listo, muchas gracias. Otra pregunta. En cuanto a los equipamientos residenciales, ¿la población está comprometida con el correcto proceso de retiro? En caso afirmativo, ¿es esto resultado de campañas?
Can you just say that again? Please repeat the question.
Sí. En cuanto a los equipamientos residenciales, ¿la población está comprometida con el correcto proceso de retiro? En caso afirmativo, ¿esto es resultado de campañas, de alguna campaña?
Look, in the residential environment, we have ran campaigns for probably the last 10 years or so. And I'd have to say that it's still to very little effect in terms of getting the community to behave in the right way. So as I say, they seem to understand that it causes cancer, but to get them to behave in the right way and not put themselves or their families or their communities at risk, we still are not getting to them about what they need to be doing. And that is, I guess, why we're looking at changing a little bit of a direction as well, and saying to governments that you need to provide some sort of assistance or subsidy to communities to help them deal with the asbestos in their home and help them to remove it. So help them to remove and replace their asbestos roof by giving them the money to do so. The same with the internal cladding, the external cladding. So the direction that we are going in now is to probably lobby governments to help communities in terms of providing them with financial assistance to do the right thing. So the fact that only one jurisdiction in Australia, which is the one that I live in, the Australian Capital Territory, actually provides free disposal of asbestos. All the other jurisdictions charge residents to dispose of asbestos, is a barrier. There's just so many barriers in place in that residential environment that we think that can only be removed by more government action.
Muy bien, gracias. Otra pregunta más es, ¿qué tanto del gasto económico de reparación y remoción en Australia es cubierto por mecanismos de justicia, donde la industria deba asumir esta responsabilidad?
As I said before, it's only in terms of compensating the victims of asbestos-related diseases. So providing money for them for their medical treatment and any loss of income, and into their families as well. And we haven't actually calculated the exact percentage, but it would probably pale into insignificance in terms of the removal from the built environment, the disposal facilities, the running of the disposal facilities, and the massive infrastructure is in place. Also, very early on, one of the manufacturers, James Hardie, also provided some money to it for an education campaign. But again, it's like insignificant compared to what we are now spending on educating the community about the dangers of their products. We recently had a High Court decision in Australia where the justices said that James Hardie should be educating the community about the dangers of their products, but they haven't done anything about that to date. So so it's government sort of stepping into that space and doing that educational aspect. And I think it will have to be governments that step in and subsidise the removal aspect as well.
Sí, muy bien, gracias. Tenemos una última pregunta y después, bueno, no es la última escrita, pero tenemos unas más por Guillermo. Entonces voy a decir la última pregunta. ¿Cuáles son las principales recomendaciones que haría para los países como México o Brasil, donde la conciencia sobre los riesgos del asbesto es baja y el marco legal con respecto a las actividades de prohibición y remoción aún están en pañales?
Yeah, I think it's trying to raise that public awareness. If you need to start with raising the public awareness about the cancer risk, and that the asbestos does cause cancer, and I guess get that civil society, get that into action there to put that pressure on government to get moving. But yeah, certainly you have to, I guess it's sort of starting from that basis about, if you have to start with raising of the health risk, start with the raising of the health risk about the causing cancer, and then give some really I guess practical actions about what people can do to keep themselves safe as well, until the framework is developed. But I think on one of the slides, you know, that I showed is sort of like the actions that I think need to be taken, and I can't sort of emphasize enough the importance of the importation ban to stop the importation and exportation, and to stop the use. So then you are only dealing with what is left within the country, and raising awareness in relation to that.
Listo. Tenemos una pregunta más. ¿Da tiempo o pasamos contigo, Guillermo? Listo. Bueno, la última pregunta es una pregunta que dice: los nanotubos de carbono son similares al asbesto, mucho más difíciles de identificar. ¿Es un tema del que hayas hablado?
I'd say no. Actually, can you just repeat that one again? Oh, no, we haven't gone into the net. No, we haven't. No.
Muy bien. Gracias. Entonces, te paso la palabra, estimado Guillermo, para que plantees tus preguntas.
Gracias, Odette. Justine, tú mencionabas en algún momento la importancia que jugaron los sindicatos en el proceso de prohibición del asbesto en Australia. ¿Tú nos podrías contar algo del rol que jugó Bernie Banton en ese proceso de apoyo a la prohibición del asbesto como trabajador de la industria?
Yeah, so Bernie Banton worked as a in what's the Labour Party, and he developed and he joined up with one of the major unions in Australia to run a campaign to raise that awareness of asbestos, and then unfortunately he developed mesothelioma and he died. So look, he was instrumental in sort of having I guess it's not being sort of having that, him representing I guess victims as a sense, and being that public face and seeing him on the television, I think was really instrumental in pushing governments to act. And that's, you know, as said, why we once governments decided in 2001 to put that ban in place in 2003 and all actually meet that date. So he was leading up to the 2001. You would see him a lot campaigning on the television. He was often on the news. He would often have to have oxygen. You know, and sadly we the whole of the Australian public sort of followed his story, and till he sort of died in the end, and you know, even on his deathbed. So it was him sort of being that face of and representing all the victims around Australia, and that joining up with the union movement. And then his wife went on to establish a foundation, Bernie Banton Foundation, that did a lot of awareness raising as well. So if you ask people in Australia, I mean, what they know about asbestos, they will probably tell you it causes cancer, and they know Bernie Banton. So being that public face having a public face was significant.
Gracias, Justine. Hace unos días estaba observando un video sobre el manejo que se le está dando en Canadá a las antiguas minas en el estado de Quebec. y veía que la población está tratando de generar algún tipo de actividades lúdicas incluso, porque hay un lago estancado pues en el hueco que dejó la mina. Y te quería preguntar, ¿cuál es la experiencia de Australia con la mina de Wittnoom? ¿Por qué te hago esta pregunta? Porque en Colombia, a pesar de que se prohibió el asbesto, obviamente la minería de asbesto incluida, existe la posibilidad de que se haga economía circular, es decir, extraer magnesio del asbesto. ¿Tú qué nos puedes contar de la experiencia que tiene en Australia en el control de estas antiguas minas de asbesto, teniendo en cuenta que ustedes explotaron asbesto azul en Wittnoom? Gracias.
Yeah. So in Wittenoom, as I said, that mine site now is completely closed. No one can go into it. So by law, it is closed to go into it, because we did have an issue of people of what they were calling adventure tourism, where people would actually just go to Wittenoom to get a selfie at the mine site. So they did close it by law only recently. I mean, it was incredibly stupid of people to go off and do that. I think there was, and I did say that there was some trouble removing some of the final residents from the site as well, but that ended up occurring. So Wittenoom, you can't go to that site by law. There is a site in New South Wales, which is former mine site. It was Chrysotile mine, and it's completely closed off as well. So it's got a complete fence around it, huge area of land that again is traditionally should be returned to traditional owners, and you cannot get into that site at all. There was a proposal to see whether that site could be cleaned up in terms of the circular economy, but I think because of our experience in Australia and going back to Bernie Banton and how it is really, if anybody wants to do anything with asbestos, it sort of immediately can get on the front page, and it's the media loves it. So I just don't see that ever occurring in Australia, just because of the history that we've had and the legacy that we have. I just cannot see that. I think those sites will remain closed off for a very, very, very long time until someone comes up with a technology to be able to clean up the soil. In terms of alternative waste technology, the federal government here did provide some grant funding for thermochemical conversion. So to set up a factory that would convert asbestos-containing materials into an inert substance that could be used for things like road fill and stuff like that. The problem with that is that it's incredibly expensive, and because we've got a big land mass, it's still cheaper to use landfill. And then there's that other issue with, as I say, this public concern that we have in Australia around asbestos, is that we don't think there could be a market for this, for the byproduct, because we don't think people could be convinced that it was safe to use. So at this stage, we're not really sort of exploring, I guess, any alternatives like that.
Ok, Justin, hay una gran inquietud y en Colombia, porque, bueno, llevamos apenas 2 años después de que la ley que prohibió el asbesto entró en acción. Y siempre la primera pregunta que se hace en los países cuando prohíben el asbesto es, ¿qué vamos a hacer con todo el asbesto instalado? ¿Sí? Y quisiera preguntarte sobre la experiencia en Australia respecto de el tema de las celdas de seguridad para la disposición final del asbesto. Hay que desarrollar, obviamente, una capacidad técnica para desarrollar estos lugares. Entonces, mi pregunta tiene que ver, ¿se desarrollaron normas desde el Estado australiano para estimular, por ejemplo, que se asignaran lugares específicos en donde depositar todo este asbesto? Y es probable que este asbesto que estamos enterrando tenga a futuro consecuencias negativas en el suelo, que logre por esta descomposición de los materiales generar algún tipo de daños en las corrientes de agua subterráneas.
So just on the first part, yeah, well, we do have quite strict regulations around those cells and how they need to be planned and then used and maintained. So we've calculated that we do currently have adequate disposal facilities in Australia, and that facilities are sort of in reasonable distance to the population centres in Australia as well. One of the problems that we do have, though, is that it's good when those facilities are used, but then because particularly residents don't know that they're dealing with asbestos-containing materials, they can take them to our landfill sites and expose workers and just disposing them as waste, not as asbestos waste, but just as actual waste, and it being asbestos waste. And then the workers at those sites are also exposed. So although we have laws around that, it's a tricky thing to stop residents from doing, particularly when they don't know that they are dealing. So they're not doing it intentionally. It's sort of the intentional that they're taking them out to these sites. But the landfill sites themselves are highly regulated, and that's under the environmental protection laws. And there's laws around when you need to put how thick the layers of soil need to be and things like that. I don't know. We haven't done any research into the negative consequences, so whether can be any seepage into waterways and things like that. Now, probably one of the reasons we haven't gone there yet is because we sort of prioritise our work. And in terms of asbestos in soil and asbestos in water, the last year or so we've been dealing with asbestos-containing water pipes, because I didn't mention that we also have thousands and thousands and thousands of kilometres of asbestos-containing water pipes. So we issued guidelines in relation to those. And one of the issues there was whether you remove these asbestos-containing water pipes from the ground, only then to transport them and to put them into one of these cells. Now, the conclusion was that as long as they are recorded where they are, they're managed where they are, they could be dealt with in situ. So our guidelines actually recommend to leave them in situ and not remove them, just because of the risk involved in digging them up, removing them, transporting them, only to put them back into the ground again. And the other part of this project we're doing with the water pipes is we're going to start tests, because we don't test from the pipes. We don't actually test for asbestos fibres in water. And so the World Health Organization doesn't require that testing, and the Australian drinking water guidelines are based on the World Health Organization. So we are going to start with the water authorities in Australia, start testing for water, asbestos in water, and whether fibres are leaching from the pipes, which I guess will lead us further down the track, probably to this issue of any sort of leakage into waterways from landfills. But then, having said that, we have, from our research, we have the adequate facilities to dispose of the legacy asbestos that's being removed from the environment, the rate that it's currently being removed at. When we had the fires in Australia a few years ago, the site in Victoria, they thought they had that future capacity, and they were sort of for 5 years or something like that, and they were used within a few months. And because of climate events in Australia, we've also had floods, terrible floods here the last year, and that's delivered a whole lot of asbestos containing rubbish as well. And so sites are being, because of climate events, our sites are being filled up very, very quickly. So, you know, it is a case we're going to be, we are going to have to look at alternatives, but the one that we were exploring, the thermochemical conversion, just doesn't seem to be the one.
Justin, una última pregunta. Recuerdo que en nuestra guía, después de la valoración de los riesgos, hablamos de cuáles son las acciones a seguir. Y siempre la acción más importante, la primera que se recomienda, es retirar el material. Pero hay una segunda oportunidad o posibilidad que es encapsular o sellar el material. Esta opción de sellar o encapsular el material, podríamos decir que ha sido exitosa en Australia. ¿Se utiliza mucho ese procedimiento? O porque a veces pienso, por ejemplo, en Colombia, a veces puede resultar más económico en sellar el material o encapsularlo antes que retirarlo cuando está en unas condiciones aceptables. ¿Qué experiencia tiene Australia en los temas de encapsulado del material cuando se decide no retirarlo porque está en unas condiciones aceptables?
Yeah, look, I'm not a big fan of sealing and encapsulating, only because, look, if proper records were kept, that was the case, that would be fine. But often it's not recorded, and people unintentionally then come across asbestos, you know, a few years down the track. So it doesn't sort of deal with the problem. It's often sort of said in this area that people flip the hierarchy of control. So, you know, the hierarchy of control is to eliminate the hazard, but for some reason when it comes to asbestos, it doesn't work like that. And in the next phase of our National Strategic Plan, it comes to an end next year. We've put it in place for 5 years, and next year it comes to an end, and we're going to start on a new phase. I really want to emphasise this point that it's got to be to eliminate the hazard, so it's the removal of the asbestos, and to stop this sealing and encapsulation. And because we've banned for 20 years now, and most asbestos containing materials in Australia, like we started using whatever, I think we found the earliest date is 1890 or something like that. They're very, very old. So to say that anything is in good condition, so we're moving away from sort of saying this thing about things being in good condition and things like that. So to really encourage that this removal, and to think of future generations as well, and deal with this hazard once and for all. So that's the approach we're taking in our next plan. But it's sort of like it's been a process for us, and it's been a journey.
Bien, muchísimas gracias, Justin. Podríamos terminar toda la mañana y toda la noche preguntando sobre asbesto instalado. Pero bueno, consideramos que es suficiente por hoy. Te agradecemos de nuevo por tu participación en este panel. Le agradezco a Odette por su colaboración en la sesión de preguntas y respuestas, a Jake por la traducción, y nos veremos en la próxima conferencia en 8 días, donde continuaremos hablando de tecnologías para manejo del asbesto instalado. De nuevo, Justin, muchas gracias, y te estaremos molestando por información para acompañar este proceso tan interesante de México.
Okay. No worries. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Justin. Have a nice day.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye a todos. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Chao,
Thanks a lot.
adiós.